Hello there. Okay, I think that's my cue. Hi everyone. Wow, what an impressive video. My name's Susie New and I'm the president of the Australian Society of Anaesthetists. And the ASA, for those of you who haven't heard of us, has been supporting, representing and educating anaesthetists for 86 years. I wish we had a flashy video that we could show you as well. So I'll be co-hosting tonight. And the panelists have asked me to just describe a little bit about who anaesthetists are, because I appreciate that we've got a varied audience out here tonight. And by the way, we've got about, I think, over 500 registrants. So wow, I'm so impressed. But anaesthetists, we're doctors. We look after you before, during and after your surgery. And as part of that, we are likely to get up close and personal with your airway, not too personal, but it means often we're doing things like what we'd say manipulating your airway. The classic one is intubation, where we're sticking a piece of, usually a plastic tube, down between your vocal cords and down into your lungs. And that's probably why we have a vested interest in the coronavirus, because it means we get very close to the source of the virus as well. I suppose one of the other big things is, as a contributor to the field of medicine, our specialty has made major inroads in terms of patient safety. If you think about where surgery was 150 years ago, and more than 50% of people would die as a result of their surgery, and how safely we can conduct anaesthesia and surgery now, and how complex patients, how much more complex the surgery has become, and how much more complex patients have become with, taking on older patients, all that sort of stuff. So we've got a big focus on patient safety, which then which then easily lends us to think about workplace safety and our own safety. I also wanted to just introduce a little bit about how the topic for this webinar came up. And that was, back at the start of the pandemic, we were getting contacted from anaesthetists who were wondering about respiratory protection, especially anaesthetists who'd worked overseas, say in Canada or the UK, where they'd been fit tested. And so we were getting asked a lot of questions about fit testing. And from there began a journey of education, really, for, I think, not just anaesthetists, but many healthcare workers, about what is respiratory protection. And it's funny to think back in May, I did a podcast with Kate Cole, who I'm just delighted is here, who's put in so much work for tonight. And I even have to double check with her that I'm pronouncing occupational hygienist correctly. So it's been a very, very steep learning curve. In the last few months, I think we've most of us are getting familiar with the concept of fit testing. More recently, I've been seeing a lot of questions about particular types of respirators, about how to clean them, about TGA approvals, about all those sorts of things that are definitely outside the remit of anaesthesia. And that's where, it's just been wonderful to collaborate with the Australian Institute of Occupational Hygienists and other experts and be able to bring everyone together to hopefully answer some questions in this webinar. So the aim of it is that it's interactive. Thank you everybody who's provided their questions ahead of time. It's meant that Kate and Jane have been able to put together a fantastic presentation, which hopefully will answer most of those questions, but we'll also have plenty of time, hopefully at the end, to even have more interaction and more discussion. We're also going to keep the chat, and I can see that people are using the chat function already, which is great, and the Q&A open, so feel free to ask questions if you're hearing things as Kate and Jane are going through them, and we'll try and answer those as well on the side. So yeah, tune in and, you know, definitely let's interact. But with that, I'm now going to hand over to the true experts on this. So thank you so much, Kate and Jane.
Thank you very much, Susie, for that fantastic introduction. So I get the pleasure of introducing our speakers and panelists today. So we've got quite a few. So to kick it off, I'm here also with Jane Whitelaw, who's also, like me, a certified occupational hygienist. She's a fellow of the AIOH. She's spent more than 25 years in corporate roles in heavy industry before she joined the University of Wollongong, where she's currently the Academic Program Director for Occupational Hygiene. She's also a board member of RespFit, which we'll talk about tonight, and the Australian Institute of Health and Safety's rep on SF10. That's important because that's the Australian Standards Committee that publishes the Australian Standards 1715 and 1716, which relate to respiratory protection. She's also a current PhD candidate at the University of Wollongong in the Faculty of Medicine, and she's investigating the physiological effects of respirator use. She also sits on the Victorian DHHS prevention mechanism subgroup that reports to the Healthcare Worker Infection Prevention and Wellbeing Task Force, which is a bit of a mouthful, which is fantastic. We also have Mark Reggers. He's an occupational hygienist and senior application engineer at 3M Australia, and he provides fantastic technical and user-end guidance and advice around the selection, use and maintenance of PPE. He's got almost 20 years in the safety equipment and training industry, and he also hosts the Science of Safety podcast, which, if you love everything about health and safety like I do, is a fantastic listen. We also have Graham Powell with us today. He's been working in the field of occupational safety since the early 1980s. He's the Managing Director of Safety Equipment Australia, specialising in respiratory protection. He's also a past president of the International Society for Respiratory Protection, the ISRP, which for hygienists is a really big deal. And lastly, but not leastly, we have Dr. Alex Birrell. She's worked in healthcare and personal protective safety for over 20 years. In her role leading clean space technology, Alex has travelled extensively supporting organisations to deliver effective respiratory protection programs for their operations. She has a fantastic working knowledge of clinical settings, having worked at the Royal Prince Alfred Hospital for over 7 years. And for the last 3 years has led teams who have deployed respirators to hundreds of hospitals across North America, Europe, Australia and Southeast Asia. And she also has a PhD in medicine and an MBA. So an amazing lineup. For those of you that don't know me, Kate Cole, I'm an engineer and a certified OC hygienist and a Winston Churchill Fellow. I've worked in industry for more than 2 decades and my main work is in the infrastructure sector. I sit on a range of industry committees, but those applicable to healthcare. The Victorian DHHS Prevention Mechanisms subgroup reports into the Healthcare Worker Infection Prevention and Wellbeing Task Force alongside Jane. And I'm the AIOH representative on the National Clinical Task Force to support the review of the HIS standard on preventing and controlling healthcare associated infection. So to kick things off, firstly, sort of the reverse of what Susie did. If you're not an occupational hygienist, you may have little to no clue what we do. To kick it off, typically it's not about washing your hands, although we are doing a lot of that in COVID, I would say at the moment, or cleaning your teeth. Occupational hygiene is all around promoting and protecting the health of workers, all workers, regardless of the industry that they work in. So an outline of what we're going to go through, we're obviously going to talk a lot about respiratory protection. I'm going to go through the types of masks, RPE uses, or we call it RPE, respiratory protective equipment, and their limitations, disposable, reusable, powered air purifying respirators, approvals and purchasing on what to look for, fit testing and respiratory protection programs and their application in healthcare. We'll also talk about TGA approval, cleaning and handling. But we can't speak about the use of respiratory protection without explaining where PPE sits on the hierarchy of control, which is of course right at the bottom. As hygienists, our focus naturally goes up to higher order controls first, which in the context of COVID might be things at the moment looking at the importance of ventilation and airflow as an engineering control, and other administrative controls, processes, procedures, training, for example, and then to PPE. So the hierarchy is ranked on effectiveness, and as we've seen, the use of PPE relies on human behaviour and knowledge to be effective. So we always want to supplement this with higher order controls where practicable. So what is respiratory protection? So we have to understand what is and isn't. Homemade masks are not respiratory protection. Surgical masks have their place, but they are not respiratory protection. All of the items of respiratory protection shown here, whether it's a disposal P2 or N95 respirator, N95 surgical respirator, half or full face, reusable or elastomeric respirator, as they're called in the States, or a powered air purifying respirator, PAPR, or PAPR, as they're called, will all provide protection from SARS-CoV-2, provided that they're worn correctly and fit tested. As Susie said, Jane and I have worked to try to answer some questions in this presentation as we go. And one of the questions we received was around what's the efficacy or what's the protection factor of cloth and homemade masks? And to answer that, I'd say that those types of masks are recommended for the general public as a public health measure to protect other people from you. They don't have a protection factor because they're not respiratory protection per se. So a bit of a side-by-side, because there can be some confusion between surgical masks and surgical respirators, and I've sort of touched on that already. But you can see here on the left the intent of a surgical mask, intended to help protect the work environment from you, and a surgical respirator is intended to help protect the wearer from substances in the work environment, so slightly different. This is a bit of a side-by-side comparison of a few things. So whenever you're choosing respiratory protection, there will always be benefits and there will always be limitations. And that's why when you're choosing it and what it's relevant for in your work task, you're looking at it from a risk-based perspective where you're weighing up those benefits and those limitations. So as you go from a surgical mask through to a P2, a half face, full face, and a powered air purifying respirator, you'll see that the price scale gets bigger and bigger. But those reusable respirators like a half face or a full face or a PAPR, you'll keep that for a long time. So the cost of that may be offset from the use of continuous use of disposable respiratory protection, for example. And as you go down that table, you'll see that you're getting more or higher levels of protection. But there are a number of limitations. When we look at respiratory protection, you'll find that whenever it's closed face fitting, a fit test is always required, and Jane will speak about that. And obviously the half face respirators are not providing eye protection, some are not splash resistant, etc., etc. And the reusables, or elastomerics as they can be called, tend to have an exhalation valve, which we'll also discuss. So I did receive a question around what role do you see for PAPRs or reusables in the healthcare sector? And really, when it comes to any type of respiratory protection, they each have an important place. Yes, they should have a place in the healthcare sector. They'll have their benefits and their limitations. We know they're used internationally to much success. But like any risk control measure like PPE, their use needs to be determined and their application needs to be determined through a risk assessment process. So when it comes to respiratory protection, specifically for SARS-CoV-2, we had a question from an occupational hygienist around determining the appropriate PPE or the appropriate type of respiratory protection. Can we suggest an exposure standard and an expected dose? So this comes back to the way that hygienists would select a respirator for use for chemical hazards, for example. And for microorganisms, it's a bit different. For microorganisms, we select the minimum respiratory protection based on the assigned risk group. So SARS-CoV-2 has been assigned a risk group 3, hence why we see P2 as the minimum standard. And these excerpts just come from the Australian Standard 1715. So there's many international standards for respiratory protection. Our preference should always be to use a respirator approved to the Australian standard, which is here. But we understand during a pandemic that supplies can be constricted. Therefore, we obviously also currently accept the use of N95s. There are other standards, such as those that refer to FFP2 and KN95s, but it's important to understand that these are not identical. In nature, there's some differences. We've also seen lots of non-compliant respirators claiming compliance as FFP2 and KN95 in Australia and internationally. So while these standards are very similar, there are some real key differences between the tests that each product needs to meet for it to be considered compliant to that standard. We received a question, should workers be concerned over P2 versus N95 versus KN95 classifications and terminology? The answer is 100% yes. Both Jane and I have worked really hard over the past 9 months or so to call out products and report products that are non-compliant with the standards that they claim to meet. Unfortunately, the vast majority of those are those that identify as KN95s. So one of the biggest differences between a P2 and an N95 is the requirement in the standard for facial fit. So in order for a respirator to provide protection, there's two main elements that need to be in place. The first is obviously filtration and the second is fit. So in the Australian standard, there's a requirement or a test called total inward leakage. We as hygienists might commonly call it the panel test. So this requires an assessment of 10 people with specific sets of facial group. So the distance between the bizygomatic diameter and mentonasal root depression length. And you can see the little screen clip that we've put there that comes straight from the Australian standard. So there's a panel of 10 people that within those face shapes, and they have to pass that test in order for that product to identify as a P2 respirator, for example. And FFP2 has a similar requirement, but no panel. So that means you can get 10 people of facial shapes, any facial shapes, and try to complete that test. And if you pass, it can be an FFP2. So we've seen lots of test reports from FFP2 equivalent new products on the market where they've used face shapes that are local to the lab that's been doing that testing. And what's local to that lab doing the testing may be a completely different demographic to the people that you have in your workforce. And traditionally, it's very different. And most notably, N95 doesn't include this test. So it has no requirement for facial fit within that, that test. Of course, when you are in the US, OSHA, the Work Health and Safety Regulator, mandates through legislation you have to have a fit test. So we received a lot of questions on the hot topic of valved respirators. So respirators with an exhalation valve provide exactly the same level of protection to the wearer as one that doesn't have a valve, so there's no difference. The presence of the valve, though, reduces exhalation resistance and moisture buildup inside the respirator. So myself in heavy industry will use them really commonly if they have to be used for an extended period of time, because generally they're more comfortable to wear. But respirators with exhalation valves will enable unfiltered air to be released outside of the respirator. So if the purpose of the respirator is to wear it to protect others, then those with exhalation valves are not recommended. So the selection of a suitable respirator needs to take this into account when you're doing that risk assessment to determine the type that's needed. Disposable P2s with valves, reusable elastomeric respirators, powered air purifying respirators will all vent unfiltered air into the environment unless there's some sort of additional cover placed on them. So what can you do? I think it's all what is appropriate will depend on what's relevant for your situation. If your situation was appropriate to use a surgical mask, then arguably using a surgical mask over the exhalation port of a reusable wouldn't probably be that much difference. So of course, whenever we talk about respiratory protection, we need to be talking about a respiratory protection program, which is required under the Australian standard, which has fantastic detail, and it lists out all these elements here. In healthcare, across many states, you'll find guidelines for respiratory protection programs. Some of these that are shown on the screen are good examples, but it's always best to go back to the Australian standard to really understand its application and apply it to your workplace. For tonight, I'm just going to focus quickly on two elements of this program. I'm going to look at purchasing, and Jane is going to speak up to me about fit testing. So the previous Australian Standard 1715 talks about the fact that the selection of respirators needs to consider conformance of the requirements of another standard, which is this one, 1716. So that specifies the requirements for testing criteria, and it's applicable to P2s, disposables, reusables, and PAPRs. So we've all seen a surge in non-compliant respiratory protection on the market, as has the TGA, because they've removed, I think, more than 500 of them from the Australian Register, the ARTG. So it suggests that we need to be a bit careful in the way that we're purchasing respirators. In June, both Jane and I authored a guide, which is shown here, to help those that are responsible for purchasing disposable P2 respiratory protection. The guide was recently updated with version 2, and it's up on the RespFit website, available to download for free. It's a fantastic resource. I'm not going to go through it in too much detail, but I'll talk about some of the key things that you should be aware of when you're provided or purchasing a respirator. The first thing to do in step 1 is to figure out the standard that the respirator relates to. So is it a P2, or is it N95, or is it a KN95, for example? It's important to check the markings on the product and the packaging, make sure it's compliant with the standard, and the guide shows you what's relevant. It's important to check the expiry date on the packaging. It's important to get a copy of the documentation and to check it, and I'll show you why in a moment. And then lastly, it's really important to get a sample of the product and try to pass a fit test on just a selection of your workers and try to get a good fit. So in healthcare, there's one more step, as I've mentioned before, the ARTG, which actually is the first step. So you need to check that your product has TGA approval and is listed on the Australian Register of Therapeutic Goods. You can do this on the web very easily by searching for it. It's a really simple process. But just because it's on the ARTG doesn't mean that it meets certain standards, and I'll show you that in a minute. So if you were going to search the products that we're talking about tonight, you would see that 3M, Sunstrom, and Clean Space Technology are all listed on the ARTG, which is great. Because the 3M products in terms of disposable are an N95, you'd also be able to go to the AIOH website in the States and verify that those products are indeed certified as an N95, which is really easy. For Sunstrom, which is a product certified to the Australian standard, you'd be able to go to the SIA Global Certificate Search to find the fact that they were certified to that standard. Also very easy. With Clean Space, you'd be able to go on the AIOH website, and you'd also see that that product was certified by AIOH. So these are really easy things that you can do to make sure that the product that you're about to buy is legit. Unfortunately, the US and the UK, many countries have found counterfeit or non-compliant respiratory protection, and AIOH has a great website on counterfeit respirators, which is updated really quite regularly. So I encourage you to go check that out. So there's a few red flags that I'll just point out. One of the biggest red flags, if you're looking at purchasing a new type of respiratory protection that you haven't checked before, is if it's a plain flat fold white respirator like is shown here with ear loops with no or incomplete product markings. That's a bit of a red flag, I would say. And if you see certificates that look like this, that's another red flag. So these certificates are commonly provided as evidence that the respirator meets a certain standard. Unfortunately, these are all from accredited laboratories, and I've picked these 4 certificates because these are the 4 most common ones that I get sent when a supplier is trying to explain to me that their product meets a certain standard. So you need to know that just because a product's listed on the ARTG, it doesn't necessarily mean that it meets an Australian standard or any other standard for that matter. And that's because the Therapeutic Goods Administration, or the TGA, do what's known as a post-market review, which essentially means they audit the documentation that comes with the product sometime after it's been listed on the ARTG. So they've been undertaking a post-market review since May, resulting in lots of cancelled entries. So just because you've been using a product which might have previously been listed on the ARTG, I encourage you to always go check that website to see if it's been cancelled, because that doesn't necessarily still mean that it's still okay to use. So now I'm going to hand over to Jane, who's going to take you through another really important element of the respiratory protection program, which is fit testing.
Thanks, Kate. So we've had a lot of questions come in tonight already about fit testing. And so I thought I'd answer the question, what is a fit test? So a fit test is a method for checking that your respirator, your tight-fitting face piece, matches your facial features and seals adequately against your skin, particularly around your nose and face, so that you can identify if there's an unsuitable respirator that, you know, maybe you've been asked to wear or you're thinking about purchasing. So it's really, really important. It's a requirement under our Australian Standard 1715 that fit testing is conducted as part of an overall respiratory protection program. So it's not just a standalone element. There's 2 recognised fit testing methods that are currently the majority in use in Australia. There's a qualitative method, and that picture up the top there is a person undergoing a qualitative fit test where an aerosol is sprayed, and the wearer of the respirator is asked if they can determine the taste or smell that agent. And there's also a quantitative fit test method. And you can see the picture down the bottom there that's using a porter count. There's an AccuFit system as well. And those are the 2 current methods that are used in the majority of Australian workplaces. Fit testing has been used in industries that I've been involved in for over 30 years. So it's certainly not a new thing, but it does seem to be new to our healthcare industry. And yeah, we want to answer all the questions that you've got tonight. So the performance of your respirator will really depend on the seal against your face. So why do we do it? Well, first of all, we want to make sure that there is a good seal that's going to protect you from anything that might be in the environment around you. We also want to make sure that it's comfortable. There's a 5-minute comfort period prior to a fit test where you put the respirator on and sort of sit with that, adjust it, get it fitting as well as you can, as you know, you think it's good fit, and then just make sure that it's comfortable, because we know that if it's not comfortable, you won't be able to work in it, and you'll keep touching it and adjusting it, and people will end up just taking it off, or worse still, you might end up with, you know, some abrasions or something worse than that. So it's also an opportunity for training. So fit testing is an opportunity for the fit tester to make sure that you know how to properly put on and take off the respirator according to the manufacturer's instructions. So one of the questions that we commonly get, and we've had a couple tonight around fit testing standards. So when to go for qualitative over quantitative. Our standards don't actually differentiate between the 2 methods. People often think, oh, if I get a number, that means that it's better. But you might choose, based on your workplace, you might choose to do a qualitative fit test if you're looking to preserve supply, because the respirator can be reused, providing you get a good fit. Or, you know, you may want something that you can go for a quantitative test. Certainly if you've got a higher efficiency respirator, then you need to go for that quantitative test. So who needs a fit test? everybody, anybody who's required to wear a respirator in the workplace. It's not only workers who are in the highest risk situations, although that might be who you prioritise to undergo fit testing. So anybody who uses respiratory protection needs to have a fit test with the same make, model, style and size that you're going to use in the workplace. It's no use being fit tested with one style of respirator and then the next week you have to wear something completely different. You can't translate that fit test. You need a fit test for each tight fitting respirator that you need to wear in the workplace. So we say fit test to fit right is our ResFit slogan. So I guess, you know, some of you would be saying, if you're in the front line, then you probably aren't saying, do I really have to? You'd be putting your hand up and saying, I really need to do this and I want to undergo fit testing. But it's a large scale program and it is a cost to organisations. So questions come up, do I really have to, and how often do I need to do it? So there are specific legal requirements around fit testing, the provision of PPE. We need, as any employers, need to make sure that it's a suitable size and fit, reasonably comfortable. Guidance is in Australian standard, New Zealand standard 1715. But there also is a legal requirement, and our regulators can impose PIN notices and fines where workplaces can't demonstrate that they've got a satisfactory respiratory protective program in place. So one of the ways that you can do that is having a documented program and having a fit testing regime in place. It's required annually or whenever a significant change occurs. You might have new dentures or have some issue facial features, and you'll need to undergo fit testing again. So to help with that, the AIOH has launched we've launched it a little early, predominantly to support healthcare workers. Official launch will be at our conference later this year. So what is RespFit? This is really your one-stop shop, and if the only thing you get from tonight is remember the respfit.org.au. That'll be great because it's the place to go to that has any of the answers around respirator fit testing. So it's a national program. Our objective is to improve worker health protection for people wearing tight-fitting respiratory protective equipment or respirators. So how are we going to do that? Well, we've got a standardised training syllabus so that we'll improve the training and the competence of the fit testers that are out there, and then they'll be able to demonstrate that by undergoing an accreditation process. And that's aligned with our international standards, ISO's International Standards Organisation. So it's ISO standard 16975-3, and that's in section 5. So it will also provide information for workplaces so that they can make an informed decision about what's appropriate and suitable for their particular workplace and environment. So you might be sitting there thinking, well, how do I know if this person who's doing my fit testing is competent? Is it somebody who had a demonstration and bought a fit test kit and off they're doing fit testing? Well, it's a little more complex than that. I mean, this is workers' lives on the line, really, we need to make sure that respiratory protection fits well, fits properly. So there are defined competencies for fit testers, and they're also in that ISO 16975 Part 3, and they include things like knowledge of the respiratory protection used for the fit test. They're not just fitting the respirator, they need to understand how the respirator works and how it's to be fitted. They need to have an in-depth knowledge of the particular fit test method. They may be accredited for 1, 2 or 3 different types of fit testing. They need to be able to set up and monitor the equipment, obviously, and conduct the test. But I think most importantly, they need to be able to identify likely causes of failures, key failures when people do fail fit tests. So it's not just something that you pick up in 5 minutes, but a great ResFit training and accreditation system is there to support our fit testers. So How do I do this? If I'm out there in a workplace, or let's say I'm at a large hospital and I've got thousands of workers, do I just get someone in, employ someone to come in and do the fit testing, or do I do it in-house? You know, we have organisations who have, you know, construction companies who might have, you know, tens of thousands of workers spread all across Australia. So it's really an individual decision whether you do that in-house and you train up people in-house to be able to perform the fit testing, remembering that it is an annual requirement. So there's an ongoing requirement there. You may choose to do that, particularly for larger workplaces, or you may decide that you're going to outsource that. That's really an individual decision for each organisation or maybe each site. So some of the questions to consider, to take back and think about in your organisation are, do you have the resources or ability to purchase the equipment? Because particularly for the quantitative fit testing, it's not cheap equipment. Do you have suitable people that are competent or that can be trained up and build up experience? It's not something really that you do once every 12 months and don't come back to it in between. I don't know if you're like me. If you don't open a computer program for a couple of weeks, you come back to it and forget how to open it and what the features are. So it's something that you really need to be conducting all the time to keep up that competency. How many people, as I've mentioned, which method. So there's a lot of things to think about before you just jump in and you know, buy some equipment and set up your own fit testing. So how do I know if my respirator needs fit testing? I've spoken about tight fitting respirators. What does that mean? That means any respirator that relies on a seal around the face to prevent the contaminant getting inside. So quite simply, anything from a disposable, a half face, a full face, still relies on a seal around the face, or even a powered air purifying respirator that relies on a seal. So a PAPA that's got a full face, or something that, you know, might have a half face that seals, needs that seal to maintain the level of protection. So I do have a couple of questions on this. People sort of say, well, you know, where I work, they just give me one type of respirator. Organisations really need to provide the equipment, a range of equipment, so that, you know, all of the staff members working in a hazardous situation can be protected and can have something that's suitable. And that's something that takes a little, you know, time and, you know, some working through and maybe negotiation. But the employer is required to provide as safe a workplace as practical. One of the questions that's already come up tonight in the chat I see is the difference between a fit test and a fit check. So a fit test is the annual test that you undergo, either a qualitative or quantitative test with a fit tester, and, you know, you get a result out of that, and that's to make sure that the respirator is capable of giving you a good fit, that it fits you, that you know how to put it on, that you know how to take it off. A fit check, or a user seal check, a fit check on the other hand is a check that you do every single time you put the respirator on. You know, it's a little bit like when I get in the car and I put my seatbelt on, you sort of, and it's probably something that you do unconsciously now, you put it on and you just check that it fits, that it's, you know, the sash is fitted tightly across you. So the fit check is something that you do every single time that you put it on. Not just the once when you did it in front of the fit tester and they may have helped you fit the respirator, but every time that you do it by your, you know, that you're putting it on by yourself. Remember that it's not a substitute for a fit test. And I know in some of the hospitals you've got PPE spotters and you're looking at that. It's really, really important that, you know, that your spotters and us in other workplaces, you know, are checking on our employees in a good way, making sure that they do that fit check before they wear the respirator. There's a simple analogy, courtesy of Mark Reggers, that he shared with me the other day. And he said a fit test is like sizing up a shoe. So you're making sure that it fits you. However, the shoe needs to be correctly laced up every time that it's worn. So both are required to have the confidence that a fit can be achieved, and in turn it's being achieved on the job. So what about these different sorts of fit tests? I mentioned qualitative and quantitative. How do you know what to do for what different type of respirator? Well, here's a simple table. You can find this on the ResFit website, so you don't have to take a screenshot or memorize it. So different tests are recommended or available for different types of respiratory protection. So if you're using a full face respirator or a powered air purifying respirator, then you need to go straight to the quantitative fit testing. Otherwise, the qualitative test is perfectly acceptable. So one of the questions that I wanted to address was around, and the question received was, do you need to get a pass in order to achieve, for every exercise, in order to achieve a successful outcome? So for those that might not be familiar, in any of the fit testing, but in a quantitative fit testing, there are a number of exercises that people perform whilst wearing the respirator, and the particle filtration is measured by the machine whilst you're doing those tests. It might be talking, it might be nodding, it might be bending over. So a range of tests are done. Now, under some protocols, OSHA protocol, for example, they just state that the average of all of those tests needs to be greater than the fit factor, the number that's required. Our concern with that is that if you are getting very high numbers, for when you're sitting or, doing these sorts of movements, and then when you bend over and you have a fail on that test, you get a very low number, that the machine, you might be able to average those out on the machine at the end of the test, and it would say, oh, that's a pass. Overall, you've done all these tests and you've hit the magic number. Our concern with that is that you might fail on a specific movement, for example, bending over. That's something that you frequently do in the workplace. So, if you're talking or bending over a patient's bed, for example, that would put you at very high risk of exposure if that's an exercise that you failed in the fit test. So to address this concern, ResFit recommends that fit test operators manually stop. So if you have a fail during the test protocol, that you stop whenever an exercise fails, irrespective of the result of the overall test results, and that we recommend that an adequate pass is achieved on all exercises. Now that's fairly detailed. You can find that in the FAQs, the frequently asked questions on ResFit. So this fit factor, the magic number that's required to get a successful fit test in the quantitative system, how does that work? How do these port counts or AccuFit things work? Well, what they do is you put the respirator on, and simply it measures the particles in the outside air and the particles inside the respirator, and it does a comparison, and the factor is the difference between the particles on the outside and the particles on the inside. So on our next slide, we've got an example of different fit factor pass levels, and depending on the type of respiratory protection that you're wearing, then you need a different pass level. So for our half face pieces, we need to get 100, an average of 100 over all those tests, but we advocate 100 for each one of those tests. 1,000 for things like your PAPAs, clean space halo pictured there, or a full face, 1,000, and for the full face respirator, 1,000 as well. So the specific protocols and all that information is in our standards, and your experienced fit tester would be familiar with those. Any questions, you can take that back to the ResFit website. So let's say you're aware, you're not doing fit testing, you're just out there being an end user, needing to wear a respirator. What are the things that you can do to protect yourself? And what can you observe in the people around you to make sure that they're protected? So Do follow the manufacturer's instructions. All approved respirators are required to have manufacturer's instructions. Be clean shaven, mostly for the boys. Nose piece at the top. Much to my daughter's distress, I saw someone on an escalator going the other way in a shopping centre last week and yelled out to them that their nose piece was down the bottom there. Straps worn correctly. Wear your safety glasses while fit tested. If you have to wear glasses or safety glasses in the workplace, then make sure you're wearing them. Don't pull the straps through the staples. Don't have facial hair. Don't put anything between the respirator and the face. This is really important. If you've got to put foam or tape or something like that between the respirator and your face, that is not appropriate. That's not a tight-fitting respirator. That's not how respirators are approved. Okay, so that's a bit of a red flag straight away. We're saying don't wear the respirator over a surgical mask. If you're going to put a surgical mask on, it goes over the top. And don't wear thick makeup or lotions that might cause the respirator to slip on your face. So you can just pop it. Sorry, Kate, can we just go back one? I'm making you work tonight. Just pop in the chat there. We need to get a little bit interactive. We've been sitting for quite a while. Those photographs on the right there, what can you see that might be an issue? I do love the one of Beyonce. What are the issues there with the chap on the left and Beyonce on the right? So just pop that in the chat so that others I can tell that you're still awake out there. Thanks, Kate. Oh, these guys are onto it. So common questions that come up. And Kate, I've got a couple of questions for you here. These are questions that we get quite commonly. So, is it okay if my glasses are fogging up?
No. That's
No.
a sign of
Why not?
poor fitting respirator. It's a sign of a poor fitting respirator. So if your glasses are fogging up, you've got a gap and the exhaled air is coming out that way, which means that inhaled air can also go through that way.
Okay. So is it difficult to communicate when wearing a respirator? You know, we've got a lot of healthcare workers on the line out there and they're needing to interact with patients and give instructions. Is it difficult to communicate in your experience as someone who wears a respirator for 10, 12-hour shifts in a quite demanding environment? What do you think?
So I think when you first start using respiratory protection, it can be a bit difficult, but you quickly learn how to compensate. The way not to compensate is to pull it down to talk. That's a big no-no. Just speak loudly and clearly and directly to the person that you're speaking to, and it will actually get easier over time. So I think it just takes a bit of getting used to.
Great. And the last question I'm going to throw at you, we can come back to the others if we have time. How long does a fit test take? Now, I know that you did a great video of this that was doing the rounds on Twitter. So how long does it take for a fit test?
Well, apart from the 5-minute comfort period, which wasn't amenable to show on Twitter because that's boring to watch people wear a respirator for 5 minutes who know how to wear one. But apart from that 5-minute piece of getting comfortable with your respirator, it really does depend on how many types of masks you're going to be doing fit testing with. Typically, in my experience in industry, it's less than 15 minutes, sometimes even much, much quicker for experienced users.
Great, thank you. So how do I find one of these fit test providers? Okay, I've mentioned it about 100 times. Jump onto the ResFit website, respit.org.au. Look at the frequently asked questions. You know, we won't have time tonight. We could spend 10 hours on this and not answer everyone's questions. So jump on there, and there are some emails that you can email us at to get answers to very specific and technical questions. But just lastly, the key thing that I wanted to leave you with is it's not just about fit and filtration. A lot of conversation has been around, filtration capability of respirators and how the standards are done. In Australia, we promote that you use a P2 respirator approved to Australian standards whenever possible. Okay, and Kate will talk briefly about that. But the other thing is that it has to fit you. We've spoken at length about that, but you need to wear it. The best filter only works if you wear it correctly all the time. If you're in a high risk situation and you take, particularly with something like COVID, where we don't know what the exposure threshold is for infection, if you take that respirator off, you know, or adjust it even momentarily, then you could be putting yourself at very, very high risk. So wear time is critical. Thanks, Kate.
Sorry, I almost spoke on mute. So just quickly before we kick off to our fantastic presentations from the rest of our panelists, I just want to reinforce that this really is the last line of defence. So it's important that we look at it, but it's important that we provide a lot of information, because the effective use of respiratory protection really does rely on human behaviour to be effective. So I would like to kick off and hand over to Mark Reggers to do a short presentation on some of his products and his amazing knowledge. So thank you, Mark.
Fantastic. Thank you, Kate and Jane, for your fantastic information so far. So if you just want to click forward to the next one there for us, Kate. So most people are probably going to be familiar with 3M's range of disposable or filtering face piece respirators. Some of the common models there you're probably familiar with or seen and used. Sort of alluded to, we have some products that are rated at N95, and then we have some products that are rated at P2. I just want to sort of explain, you know, they often get that term interchange, P2 and N95 treated as the same, which, you know, from a filtration point of view are very similar. So I'm just going through the next slide there, Kate. So a common question I get asked, and probably those in the respiratory space, is what is the smallest size that a particulate filter can filter down to? So when it gets really, really tiny, we're talking about nanomaterials, but it's kind of not the right question to ask. The right question to ask, what is the hardest particle size to capture? And this is where we start looking at what we call the most penetrating particle size. So a P1, P2 and P3 all get tested to the same test aerosol size. You can see on the screen there around 0.3 to 0.6 of a micron. That is around about the hardest particle size to capture. When you get above 1 micron, the particles actually travel in a straight path. So a P2 greater than 94% efficiency, that's greater than 94% against the hardest particle size to capture. So when we start talking 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 microns, they get captured really, really efficiently because of the size is quite large. When we start getting smaller, start getting a bit smaller than 0.1 micron, the efficiency goes back up. Because those particles are so small, they get bashed around by the air molecules and actually have a really random path throughout the filter bed. So there's actually a higher probability and likelihood of that really small particle, nanomaterial, whatever it may be, actually crashing into a fibre there. So when we talk about 94%, 99.95%, that's against the hardest particle size to capture. So we can go through to the next slide there. So that's a P2, 94%. And we often hear this term N95. So the N95 is the US American rating system. And that 95 refers to, under their test criteria, it has to be at least 95% efficient against that hardest particle size to capture, which is why from a filtration point of view, there are other differences already been highlighted between the overall standard testing, but from a filtration point of view, they're quite similar in that particular area. But the US also have R and P series that you may or may not be aware of. They get tested against an oily particulate because the oil does have an effect on the electrostatic attraction of respirators, so they have to have a pass on a different type of test aerosol. The US, they don't have a P1, we don't have an N99, so there are different ratings around the world, but quite often that is why we talk about N95 P2 and that most penetrating particle size. Other countries do have standard similar ratings. They've already touched on KN95, FFP2. From a genuine product that meets the standard, yes, but unfortunately what we've seen, there are, especially the KN95 sort of category, the majority of those are very much, we would not rely on them to be performing at that standard. So we'll try and steer clear of those in the current environment and use those Australian standard or NIOSH approved genuine products there. You click through the next slide there, Kate. So just click, if that's okay. So there's going to be a decision pathway depending on the situation, the hazard, as Kate said, what fit test method, what product is really going to come down to that risk assessment on what's suitable. Are you trying to protect the environment? Are you trying to protect yourself? So it's a very basic decision tree there that we put out there just to help people have that, go through that process of I'm protecting myself or I'm trying to protect the environment. Just go to the next slide there, Kate. I think Jane's really quite well alluded to, the importance of fit. And it's fantastic to show those pictures in a way of that upside down. Fitting a respirator is certainly not hard, but there are certain key things that people do need to know. And I've highlighted two sort of red squares there about the moulding of the nose bridge. We're all different, our facial shapes and characteristics. That's a critical component of that fit adjustment to you as the individual, and going through that fit testing process and doing that user seal check. Also, that the doffing of the respirator, ensuring that you're not touching that filter material when you're taking it off. A couple of the questions that did come through prior to the webinars, the questions about 3M do manufacture reusable respirators and powered air purifying respirators. It's a common question around the TGA registration. From a 3M perspective, and every organisation will approach this differently, but from a 3M point of view, 3M don't manufacture reusable respirators or PAPRs specifically for healthcare or clinical environments. We don't make any therapeutic claims. At this point in time, we don't plan to make any therapeutic claims. We don't class it as a medical device as far as the 3M goes. So it would be classed as a piece of PPE under the TGA for organisations to consider in that space. So thanks for your time there, and hopefully you've got something out, and hand on to the next panellist.
Thanks, Mark. Now I'm going to hand over to Graham Powell from SEA to talk to you about sunstroms.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you very much. And thank you, Kate and Jane, for putting on such a great presentation, and thank you too, Susie. First of all, I'd just like to talk about the half mask and the full face mask. It's the SA100 half face piece, SA200 full face. Both these respirators are tight fitting respirators, elastomeric face pieces, and they require a filter to be attached to them, and they have exhalation valves. Both masks use the same particle filter and pre-filters. Next slide, please. The masks are, of course, approved to Australian standard licence, and there's been a question in there about auditing. Anybody that has Australian standard licence for a product, the manufacturer has to have an ISO 9000 2015 quality assurance plan for their company, and then within that quality plan they have to have a documented quality plan for the production of each product. There is a strict auditing program, and each manufacturer is audited on site yearly, and any faults are recorded that are found out in the field and identified. So this should give the wearer some confidence. Also, the purpose of that is to make sure that the product that is approved is the same product that you will get a year later, a year after that, or the year after that. But just some basic things here that I thought I'd just cover how to wear a half-face respirator. This might vary between different brands, but you should, first of all, sling the half-face piece neck strap, and with the Sunstrom respirator, that is, start from the bottom, lift the mask, place it to your chin, draw the strap over the top of your head, and then pull the strap either side just to make sure that the elasticity is even and even the tension. A lot is not thought about the actual head strap when it comes to a respirator. It's a very important part. So you should make sure, whatever half-face piece you're wearing, that you follow the user instructions and put the harness on as it is supposed to be. This is a diagram of how the Sunstrom respirator is to be. The strap supports the mask on the face, and we spoke a lot tonight about fit testing and the importance of maintaining a face seal, and the head strap goes a long way towards that. The elasticity in the strap allows the mask to move with you when you're moving around, as Jane mentioned before, and also to make sure when you're talking, etc., that the jaw is moving, that the mask will stay in the location where you wear it. Next slide, please. So a basic thing here, how does it work? So fit testing is important because we need to know that the respirator has a tight seal around the face. Unlike a filtering face pieces, the mask body obviously is a sealed unit. So we need to draw the air through the filter. So with a good face seal, etc., we inhale, that creates a negative pressure inside the mask and draws the air through the filter to the wearer. And then the exhaled air creates a positive pressure inside the mask, which then forces the exhalation valves to open and getting rid of the exhaled air. Respirators are designed, half face pieces have exhalation valves primarily to protect the wearer. The exhalation valves are designed obviously to clear the exhaled air out of the air as efficiently as possible and maintain a low level of CO2 in the mask from our exhaled air. Next slide, please. Some of the questions we've seen have been about cleaning of respirators. We were asked, how do I clean my mask not in a hospital situation? Here I would say Australian standard licensed products require every mask and every filter to come with a set of user instructions. So always follow the user instruction for what respirator you're wearing. Now you can wash the silicone SO100 respirator and all its components in warm soapy water. You can also clean it with alcohol wipes. You can also clean the unit in an autoclave, and we have a test document for that. We also have a test document for alcohol, though I don't think many people are using that or soaking the product in alcohol. It's very difficult to handle. And then we have to follow your local or Australian guidelines for disposing of chemicals. So there's many ways that can be done, and we can supply a copy of some of those test results if required. Next slide, please. We've touched on this quite a bit through the presentation, but just to keep it short and simple so there's time for questions, the respiratory management program described earlier by Kate and Jane in 1715 is very, very important. It doesn't matter how good your respirator is or what type it is. If you don't do the proper fit testing, if you don't do the proper training, if you don't have a good cleaning and return to user program in place, just to name a few, then you're not going to get the benefit of the respirator that you're wearing. And as Jane pointed out earlier, if you only remove the mask for a second or etc., you can make a big difference to the protection factor that respirator will afford you. Particle filters should not be washed. They can be soaked in alcohol, the 510, and reused, but they're not designed to be put in autoclaves and washed in soapy water. The 510 particle filter is a hyperphobic fiberglass material, which is water resistant and will filter out all the contaminant particles. In fact, that's the same particle filter that is used in our CBRN, AIOH and European approved respirator. So with that, I'll pass it back to Kate. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Graham. Okay, so we've got our last presentation, which is from Dr. Alex Birrell to speak about her fabulous product as well. Over to you, Alex.
Thanks very much. So today I'm just going to talk about PAPRs and in general how they work. CleanSpace is a TGA approved, CleanSpace Halo is a TGA approved PAPR for healthcare, but in general these comments apply to all PAPRs. So a PAPR is actually, unlike the products that we've talked about previously and on all those other slides, are a pressurized system, so they have an active air. So they have a little motor, a fan, electronics. They pull air through the contaminated air through the filter, and generally you'll find that's a HEPA filter, so high efficiency particulate. In our case, we certified to the highest level, which is 99.97% filtration efficiency or above, and that's the AIOH certification. So it's an active airflow. Typically you can see very high volumes, so up to 250 or higher litres per minute. And what it does is that clean air then gets pushed into the mask, and then importantly, and this is where the active air really comes in, you're getting a pressurised mask. And so unlike the negative pressure or passive respirators, you're getting positive pressure in the mask, positive pressure compared to the ambient. And that, when it's on, overcomes the leaks that you can experience in having a mask on your face. And that's very important, and that's generally why PAPRs are considered higher protection than negative pressure or what they call passive respirators. And as Kate and Jane have both mentioned, typically with PAPRs, you will see the exhaled air unfiltered, so it either comes out, in CleanSpace's case, there's an exhalation valve on the front, or if you've seen or had any experience of the hoods, of course they leak out the bottom of the hood or out underneath the chin. So I'm just going to, so some of you have probably already seen the CleanSpace, but it's worth just doing a very short demo. So this is the CleanSpace system here. We have the powered system at the back here. And you've got a little filter, which is the PAPR filter sitting at the back where the air goes in at the back. So if I'm a user, I pick up, and again, just to reiterate all of the speakers previous, of course you would be using this with training and also some fit testing. So presumably you've had those two and you're going to don your respirator, you pick up your powered system, checks, etc. I've picked up the right size mask for me. I put it around my neck. I might be wearing glasses, and the system is on. And so now it's operating, it's giving me nice air, system at the back, and that's how it works. And donning it is, so the doffing is relatively simple, and again, we work with infection control and also what we call the super user groups, which mostly through COVID have been really driven by the anaesthetist, and we talk to them about their doffing protocol. Typically with the CleanSpace, particularly that half mask version, where really, a lot of them have protocols already in place for their donning and for their doffing, and where they've got their N95, the CleanSpace PAPR will just slot into that because it's generally compatible with a lot of the other PPE they're wearing. Just to say, we are NIOSH approved. We are also TGA approved. It has the CE mark and also the Australian standards for PAPRs. There is one thing that I would like to say that I haven't heard spoken specifically around COVID, and I think it's worth mentioning, and certainly a lot of the hospitals that we work with talk about this, and it's really not so much the exposure, but it's also the time, and I know that Jane and Kate will also be appreciative of this, but it's also time they have with that particular airborne hazard, and in this case COVID and this pathogen. You're looking not just at the concentration, which I know is very relevant for high risk procedures, but it's also time around that pathogen. So again, that's really where the COVID wards come in, or if the anaesthetist is sitting for long periods of time with COVID patients, or they're doing a difficult intubation, extubation. So in those regards, I think it's really important to know that not only are you at risk if you have direct exposure, such as the AGPs, but also if you are spending a significant amount of time and exposure with that potential pathogen. So can I just have the next slide, please? Thanks very much. So just a little bit of background, a little bit of information around advantages and disadvantages of PAPR systems. So I guess the key advantages of a powered system is that you are looking at a significantly higher level of protection. So that not just it's the HEPA filter, but you're also looking at that positive pressure mask, which overcomes a lot of any sort of breaches in the mask seal at all. And of course, you've got comfort. Now, many of you have that experience of wearing the N95, particularly, as Kate said, without the valve, and you've got some of those difficulties in terms of breathing resistance, particularly heat is a very big one we hear a lot of in healthcare, and the glasses fogging. Now, fit testing aside, you do see fogging regardless, because you do see those breaches in the leak and the seal. So comfort's a really big one. You have that nice, lovely, clean air onto the face. You've got the breathing resistance is no longer, just gets rid of that altogether. And of course, the most important thing, you don't get any sort of fogging of your glasses. And that's a really important one, particularly if you're in the middle of a procedure. We heard a horrific story from one of the surgeons who said they were wearing an N95 while they were cutting away at one of the vessels of a man's neck. They were 5 hours into the surgery, and their glasses were fogging up, and he certainly was suffering from heat stress. So one of the things that's a consideration for those sorts of situations is that when you have people wearing masks for a very long period of time, certainly heat and glasses fogging is very important consideration. With PAPRs, they are reusable, and reusable is a sort of a double-edged sword in healthcare in many ways. And so what we've learned through this pandemic is, of course, that those global supply chains become very vulnerable to high use, particularly when you've got government regulations, you've got a lot of healthcare facilities purchasing, and then most importantly, you've also got the consumers out there also competing for that very valuable resource. So what a reusable respirator can do is, once you've got it in place, you've got it in place forever, and it gives you, your organisation, and all of your colleagues that kind of peace of mind that you've got good protection on hand, regardless of what your peak patient loads look like. So the other one, of course, is, particularly if you're looking at facilities, and probably not relevant for this group, but is significant lower cost, particularly through those really high peak loads. Some of the disadvantages, and these are really important to mention, is, and Kate did a beautiful sort of description of the communication. So I guess one of the things we would say is communication's not too bad if you're outside the theatre for clean space. You've got a transparent mask, and we get a lot of positive feedback about that. When you go into theatres, and there's a few more things happening, that's where we hear the comments around communication. Certainly the motor is not an issue. It's really about what's sitting on your face. And in theatre, again, you're working probably with a surgical mask over the front, and again, blinding any of your colleagues to what the wearer is saying, and of course their movement of their mouth. In that scenario, and Kate's, again, just to reiterate what Kate was saying, that you've got, you take on some very distinct ways of communicating, and we've seen a lot of the theatres really adopt some of that, either where they're wearing clean space, or they may already be wearing N95s or similar. Cleaning and reprocessing. So we get a lot of questions around cleaning and reprocessing. I'll talk about that in the next slide, but that's something you have to do over and above, of course, the disposable masks. And then, as with all of the products, but particularly with when you've got a few more, when you've got reusable systems, that training on the parts and the assembly, donning and doffing, are really critical for your staff, you and your staff, to really have confidence in the product that they're wearing, and also that if they have any questions throughout that period, that you can be able to answer them. Can I have the next slide? Thanks. Thanks very much. So this is a little bit on the cleaning and disinfection, sterilising. Look, Clean Space has got a long history in medical device. We were really founded by a group of biomedical engineers that came from ResMed, so a lot of history there. we've taken our technology and adapted it for a healthcare environment, which is the Clean Space Halo, and it is made of all those medical grade materials. So just to carry on from what Graham was saying earlier, we essentially, you know, you can use all your stock standard washing, etc., and also wiping down with, say, a Clinell wipe or a Tuffy wipe, which are typically found in most hospitals. We've gone through COVID. What we found is not just here in Australia, but certainly globally, a lot of the hospitals have moved away from just wiping down, and they've taken more aggressive sterilising and in some cases, more aggressive disinfection and in some cases sterilising techniques. And so we've also adapted our IFUs, our cleaning instructions, if you will, to match some of those more, I guess, more stringent methods of cleaning and disinfection reprocessing. And so there's just some dot points up there, but essentially with the Clean Space you can both clean, you can disinfect, and you can also sterilise depending on what protocols. And also I think what we've seen is particularly in Victoria, where you've seen a heightened level of anxiety, particularly where they've had very high levels of or high rates of infection amongst their healthcare teams. That's it. I think if there's any questions I can specifically around cleaning, I can certainly take those offline.
Thanks very much, Alex. Well, I'm going to hand now to Jane, who's going to pepper all of us with questions.
Well, I think thank you to Kate and all our other panellists. You've answered so many of the questions that we had up front and many more that have come in over the chat. If you did ask a question, please just have a look at the Q&A. I've responded to, and our other panellists may have responded to a number of the questions there because we won't have time to answer every question. So I'm going to start with the ones that have been voted highest up the top. And this is, while I've got you on the line, Kate, people are, and I have heard this myself from healthcare workers, that there's been, they've found that they've been getting some ulcers and pressure sores created by wearing the respirators. Now, you work in the construction industry where people wear respirators in a very dirty, abrasive environment for up 12-hour shifts, day in, day out. So is that something that we're seeing in other industries? And do you have any ideas what that might be caused by?
Okay, so we actually don't see this very commonly in industries, in heavy industry. And I predict that's because of the types of respiratory protection that we're using in industry. So when I've seen this happen previously, like pressure sores and things like that, I anticipate it's coming from really trying to fit that mask really, really tight onto the wearer's face to A, get a fit test, and then B, try to keep it there as much as you can. That's what I anticipate. In heavy industry, using disposable P2 N95s, reusable, it's incredibly rare for us to see a pressure injury, because when we're doing fit testing, we're making sure that the mask that we're providing to that worker is fitting them comfortably and isn't causing pain over time.
Wow, thanks, Kate. If I could just ask Graham and Mark if you guys could show us your lovely faces and come back online. You're trying to hide from questions, I know. So Mark, a question for you that's come up, and I predict that this is more likely to happen with the disposable type respirators. People are asking, they're saying they've seen people fit tested with a colloidal dressing that's being recommended by a certain department. So the dressing goes under the respirator, probably around the nose piece, to get a better fit or to protect some skin breakage. So do you have any comments on that, please?
Yeah, it is something I guess I've seen more globally with different comments and questions, and with organisations and trying to address these pressure injuries, and we'll talk about having these different bandages across the noses to address that. On a surgical mask, that's not as much as a concern, because obviously that is not designed to fit tightly and provide that protection. We would not recommend it as far as the ResFit and the AIOH goes. Anything that is lifting the respirator off the face is going to be creating a gap around the seal. When we think about the size of you know, microns. They're way smaller than facial hair, way smaller than these different bandages that wearers may be having to try and address that comfort. So you would not be doing that. Sometimes you'll hear they say, what if I pass a fit test with these bandages, if I wrap it all around your face? The concern there is about repeatability. You know, the fit test is there to replicate what you do on the job. It's not about doing whatever you can do to pass the fit test and just go back to what you're going to do on the job. So certainly you'll be looking at, you know, pressure injuries. There's just look about skincare. There's definitely different type of lotions that you can use that don't interfere with the seal. Obviously still maintains the skin is breathable, so moisture can evaporate off the skin. They don't require removal or washing, so it's going to come down to really try and look at some of that skincare if you are finding you are seeing those pressure injuries after wearing respirators for periods of time.
Great, thanks Mark. Now, Graham, a number of people have asked the question about reusables in healthcare industry in particular, and issues around the exhalation valves and releasing unfiltered air back into either sterile environments or you know, when workers are in close proximity and could be infecting each other. So questions around in particular your product, whether and you may have mentioned this and I missed it, whether there's a move to be able to provide some sort of filtration inserts.
Thanks, Jane. Yes, I've seen those questions come up. As I stated earlier, the reusable respirators are face pieces. They're designed to protect primarily the wearer, and we have that exhaled air coming out through the exhalation valves, which may be, so it's not designed actually, initial intent to protect other people other than the wearer. We are looking at different ideas about that. As Kate mentioned earlier, if you're in an environment where you're already wearing a surgical mask, which is loose fitting, not tight fitting, air always follows the easiest path on inhalation and exhalation. And the speed of the air traveling on our inhalation cycle and exhalation cycle can be quite fast. So it will follow the easiest path and shoot off in different directions. Those very small particles, viruses, etc., or other contaminants in other industries will then find their way out and into the atmosphere. We are, however, though, looking at ways to alleviate that problem here in Australia, and but there's a few things to consider. If we put a cover on the outside of the exhalation valve, it needs to be tested quite thoroughly with the material, because you're drawing a lot of air in through a large surface area on your inhalation cycle. Yeah. And our particle filter has 1,300 square centimetres of surface area. That's to keep the pressure drop down and to increase your particle capturing area, if you like, longer life. But the same air, when you exhale, has to go out through those two small, comparatively small exhalation valves, which may only have a surface area of a few centimetres.
So that goes out a lot faster, doesn't it, Graham? You get quite a jet of air out of that.
And that exhalation resistance is something that has an effect on people. So yes, we are looking into it, but we need to make sure if we do come up with a cover or some sort of an outside filter, that first of all, it does not affect the exhalation resistance too much, doesn't interfere with the activity of the valve, so how the valve opens and closes, in order, which is a very important part of protecting the wearer. And also that the material that we might use can actually handle any contaminated exhaled air from the wearer at the air speeds that it will be going through.
Yeah, so Graham, can we come back to you down the track on that through ResFit, and if products like that become available, then you know, maybe we can add that to the FAQs, and people can come back to that point.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Certainly, Jane, if I could say, we have developed an exhalation filter for the PAPA, and it is approved under NIOSH and the European standards. So it goes over, it's a 95% filtration efficiency over our exhalation. So there's a little bit of differentiation there between the passive and the positive pressure.
Thanks, Alex. I was just about to comment on that because I know you and I discussed that the other day when we were doing our prep. So thanks for that. Susie, we've still got a couple of questions there. We've responded to most of them in our Q&A, in the chat, in our Q&A. Is there anything in particular that's come up for you that you know that is an issue for anaesthetists that maybe we haven't addressed, or that may not be available immediately on ResFit that we might need to provide some advice on?
Sure, I suppose a couple of things. I saw there's a busy typing back an answer to the chat. It's a lot of conversation going on. I think there was one there that I said I would answer live about the clean space and why it hasn't been made available for individual users. And I just wanted to say that Clean Space and the ASA have been working together to look at a way that we can make it available for anaesthetists. And I suppose for ASA members would be our way of sort of looking at it at the moment. And you know, I think with that, there's been, I think, a lot of, from my end, a lot of pushback or caution really from hospitals in terms of having people bring in their own particular device on the day and not really having any I suppose control over how that device is used. And so, you know, we've wanted to tread very cautiously, and we're hoping that by having something that's got, you know, something's been developed that's fit for purpose, fit for our workplace, that maybe that will get better engagement with the hospitals, that they'll think that this is something that anaesthetists have worked on. They've come up with a protocol for its use that seems very appropriate. Clean Space are also very happy with it to be used in this particular way. So ASA members, watch this space. Alex and I are in regular communication about this, and we're hoping that we can make some sort of announcement soon. So just to, I suppose, answer that question. I think, and apologies if I've missed it, but I wanted to really come back to the fit testing. I know we've had a lot of discussion about it already, but one that I particularly get a lot about is, you know, the facial hair, the bandaging or whatever, you know, the dressings on the face. You know, I see that very commonly in my workplace, and I'll make a comment about it because I can't help it. And the response I almost always get is, I got fit tested with this amount of facial hair, or I got fit tested with my duoderm dressings over my nose, and the porta count readings were great, and I was unfortunately reassured that that is fine. So I heard what Mark said about the reproducibility of that, but so I just really want to emphasize that. Is there any other things that you think that we should add to that message? Just the shaking of the heads.
You're going to say something.
No, I was gonna probably hand it back. I would say this is not dissimilar to industry, Susie. So way back in the dark ages, when fit testing was first coming out, like decades ago, this was also a thing. But there's been, and Jane and Mark, Graham, Alex can cite countless studies on the lack of reproducibility of that result. And so I'm sure that Jane and Mark will talk about the fact that we wouldn't even be fit testing people that have facial hair. It's a 100% no-no.
It's a no-go, do not pass go type situation.
Agreed. And facial hair can change day by day. That's the other thing. So if somebody has a beard or light facial hair, and they achieve barely, even if they get a face fit today, that evening they might not, or the next day they might not, because it changes all the time.
Yeah, absolutely. A great illustration of that. Now, Mark Reggers, I'm not sure if it's on your 3M Science of Safety podcast or just on your LinkedIn. I know you actually did an evaluation there where you took your facial hair and you showed the size of that compared to common contaminants such as dust and so on, aerosols that we commonly encounter in workplaces. So if you can't find that out in your land, then drop Mark a line, or I'm sure he'll be able to put that up on some social media again so that we can find that and have a look.
Yeah, we do, and so some of the questions, FAQs on ResFit, have studies that have evaluated the fit factors of facial hair. So certainly if you go to some of the resources section, we do have studies that have looked at that, talking about, you know, the 300% drop in protection levels. As Graham said, facial hair is a moving target. I remember in high school having mates that had a 5 o'clock shadow in high school. I'm still to get there. We're all different. Males are all different. So we need to, you know, appreciate facial hair is not repeatable or predictable. Talking about the fit, the HSC did a fantastic study where they fit tested multiple people on multiple brands of respirators, I think over a couple of weeks. And every day they would fit test on a range of respirators. And on day 6, someone may, with, you know, an amount of facial hair, get a pass on brand X, but they wouldn't get a pass on brand Y. So it's got to be predictable and it's got to be reliable. And that is your, you know, for a male's face, clean shaven, you know, so. We've got some great resources there, and we'll see if I can put
That's
that
a great
picture up
point.
for
So
people to
don't
look at.
forget, go to the respit.org.au, and across the top you'll see a tab that's got resources, and any question you've got, there'll probably be a resource there to answer it.
And if there's questions that aren't on there and we find they're valuable, we will add them. And it's since we've launched the website, the FAQ and resources section has been growing as questions have come through. So that'll continue to grow to make sure we get the right information out there in a central location.
That's great. Thanks, Mark.
I've just noticed the time.
Oh, we're a little bit over. We've answered most of the questions. So is there anything you'd like to say in closing, Susie? I mean, it really initiated by yourself for the ASA Society, and I'm, you know, proud to say that my bestie from school is an anaesthetist, and we've so I know what you do, and I have a lot of respect for you guys. So if there's anything else that we can answer, shout it out, or yeah, just contact us through AIOH or respit.org.au.
Great, thanks, Jan. I thought before I said thank you, I just wanted to say pretty much exactly what you just did about, you know, you've been both you and Kate, and in fact every occupational hygienist I've chatted with over the last 6 months, and I feel like I've chatted to quite a few by now, have been incredibly supportive and incredibly helpful and very, very forthcoming with information. And I think it's a great resource, the Respit website, and I really encourage people to put questions there. And also, you know, ASA members, keep your questions coming in to us as well, because that's what helps us invite Kate and Jane back again for the next webinar to know what topics we need to cover. So, and there's also a space on the ASA forum that people can share resources. So especially, I think a lot of, not a lot, but a few hospitals are now developing their cleaning protocols for things, for some of the reusable masks and the clean space. So, you know, feel free to share your resources with each other there so that we don't all have to reinvent the wheel, because, you know, it's been a very steep learning curve, and I think we've still got a fair bit to go by the sounds of it when I hear about some of the things that have been done in industry in the dark ages. We're yet to get there in the full light of COVID. But thank you, all of you. Thanks to the panelists. Thanks, Samira, if people can't see her in the background, who's done a great job of pulling everyone together. Thank you very much for pulling up the talks together in your time this evening and working around anaesthetists' work schedules, where we don't often sit around on webinars during business hours. So thank you very, very much for your time, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you all.
It's a pleasure. Thanks, Susie.
Thank you very much.
Very welcome. Thanks all.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Susie.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Kate. Thanks, Jane.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.
Thank you. Bye.